Hi, my name is Laura Grossenbacher. I'm the director of the Technical Communication Program, and I thought I would talk a bit about writing powerfully and persuasively in research proposals. I'm going to say some very general things about proposals that I hope will be applicable even though a lot of what I've said is informed by my own experience, and I know that proposals differ quite a bit from place to place and from need to need. So you should have a link to a PowerPoint presentation that I'll go through as I'm talking about these things, and that might help if you want to follow along there. A couple of things that I'll do here. I will talk first about just some critical needs that you have to consider when you're starting a proposal, and then I'll give a review on rhetoric, because one of the things that we do in my program particularly is we focus on the effective use of rhetoric to make arguments. And people begin this all the way back with the basic communication COM A course when they're undergraduates, and we try to reinforce it in the technical communication course at the junior senior level. And I think it really matters if you're going to write a proposal to know something about rhetoric. So I'll be getting into that. I guess the first thing I can suggest in terms of just advice when you're thinking about writing a proposal is you can't, I think the tendency for people is to think about, oh, I have a really great idea. And they get really balled up in their idea, and they don't realize that what they need to do is look for a funding agency out there that matches well with their idea. Look for a funding agency that has a mission that matches with your idea. And not try to find some way, some sort of backdoor way into getting funding if the match isn't a good one. So there are good sources out there. I can suggest one person who's written some about this issue is Leanne Rafe-Lehrer, and this is there's a quote from her on page 3 of my PowerPoint presentation where she says, "Understanding that the scientific mission of the National Institutes of Health is not to fund good research, but rather to improve the health of people in the United States, should greatly affect how you present your project in ways that may, other things being equal, enhance your chances of success." And so I think what she's getting at there is that you can't get too excited about, even though you're excited about your own research, you have to think about what do they want? If this is a grant-giving agency, what is their main mission, and how does my research fit into that mission? So find a good match, first of all. And then you have to read their request for proposals very carefully so that you thoroughly understand what their mission is. I would say read it before you're drafting, before you even start drafting the proposal. Read it over again as you're drafting, and certainly at the end to be sure that you have all the pieces there. What tends to go wrong? I can speak from a bit of experience I've had for about the past 4 years. I've been a reviewer on an NSF panel, and I've noticed that a lot of the people that submit proposals to that particular panel, and this may be true for many of the panels, they're good at hitting one aspect that the NSF request for proposal tends to ask for. It tends to ask for intellectual merit, and people spend a lot of time describing the intellectual merit of their project. They're really getting into the goals of their research there. But then there's a section about broader impacts, and that really sort of drills down to how well do you understand how your work is going to impact other people. That sometimes is completely ignored in some of the proposals that I've seen, and they do go straight in the trash. And so my suggestion would be, first of all, notice what their emphasis is, because the RFP will often emphasize the key things that they're looking for, and you really have to build that into any good proposal. The other things you can do is certainly I would never write a proposal for a big grant-giving agency without looking at successful proposals that have been written in the past and seeing what kinds of things do they do. So reading those, if you can get your hands on those, sometimes even asking the grant-giving agency, do you have a website where there are successful proposals that we can take a look at? I would definitely read those and have a look at just what they're doing. Know about the different audiences and how they're likely to be impacted by your proposal. So if it's the case that you happen to be looking at a proposal that's request for proposals that says we want to impact, let's say, Native American populations. you want to figure out a way to be sure that the research you do does impact that population in some significant way and speaks to their needs. And then beyond just thinking about intellectual merit, broader impacts, in any request for proposals, there are a lot of different sections, and you just have to be meticulous about filling the needs of those different sections. I've seen proposals that must have taken people many weeks, if not months, to put together, go straight in the trash simply because they forgot to put a section in, or they forgot to do some critical thing like get the kinds of letters of support that they needed. And reviewers of an NSF panel will simply say, we can't trust this person to do good work with the money we might give them if they didn't even do this right. And so you really have to be meticulous about all the directions that they give you. But now I want to talk a little bit about the different the sections that I think are critical to a proposal, any proposal, and the trickiest ones. And to me, often the trickiest part of any proposal is the argument section. Sometimes it's called a statement of problem or need. In an NSF proposal, it might be called intellectual merit, but a lot of different proposals will say statement of the problem or need, and sometimes it'll even be called background on the problem. So it's usually several paragraphs long, if not several pages, and that builds an argument for the objectives of the proposal, and that's the other tricky section. So to me, the biggest challenges of any proposal are the argument for need, and that's got to be carefully linked to the direct objectives of your research. So some strategies for your argument. I'm on page 6 of the PowerPoint presentation if you're looking at that. You should consider carefully who your audience is, what they might want and need, and think beyond just, I'm writing this to, let's say, an NSF panel and what their mission is, but think about who do they want to impact broadly, and how can I make the research that I want to do impact all of those different audiences. Animate those needs in your statement of the problem by bringing in relevant and colorful details that will really speak to the needs of that audience. So of course that requires quite a bit of research. Often in the statement of the problem, you do have to review relevant research and establish that, first of all, that you know about the existing research and that you know about a hole in that research. You have to demonstrate that there's some kind of a gap that your research intends to fill. So you use details, you try to support those things with evidence from all of the different researchers that are out there, clarify points that might not be clear to the audience that you're writing to, and the thing that's funny to me is that often researchers in a field assume everybody understands their terminology, especially if they're writing to an NSF panel. They'll assume that there'll be experts on the panel who know the terms, and I would say that's a tricky and maybe even dangerous assumption, because while there certainly are going to be experts in the room, sometimes there will be people outside of your discipline, and it's always good, in my opinion, to write for a multidisciplinary audience, so explaining and clarifying points when you can. And then just be careful to organize those points very logically so that people will feel like this argument is fluid. This point necessarily leads from the previous point. I have talked to people right here on campus who are engineering professors who've said to me, yeah, you're not right about proposals. Proposals are easy to write. All you have to do is just get the facts out there. Once you do that, your proposal will be successful. And I guess I would challenge that by looking at some of the proposals those folks have written to note that it's not just a matter of sprinkling facts out. You have to think about the order of those facts and choosing the right facts that are going to appeal to specific audiences of that proposal. So I think that there's a lot of sort of rigor and judgment that has to go into what you decide to put into your argument. Don't assume that your audience is going to be accepting and open to all of your ideas. I think it's good to go in and say to yourself, the audience might be skeptical. They may be saying to themselves, wait a minute, aren't there better alternatives than what you've got? And wait a minute, do we have to do anything? So you have to try to convince those people that there's a need to move on. So one way that we try to teach our students to think about this in the technical communication class and even in basic communication is we introduce them to Aristotelian rhetoric, and that's going back to 350 BC, and we look at these three elements that Aristotle said are the part of any good argument, that any good argument requires that you engage with the emotions of your audience. Aristotle used pathos, which is Greek for emotions. And he looked at this as sort of, these three elements really are sort of in a triangle. They're interrelated in a sense. You've got to consider the emotions of the audience. You also have to consider your credibility. He called it ethos, which stands for, it's a Greek word for character. But when you think about your ethos, you're thinking about, how do I come across as a credible and trustworthy writer? And you build that in subtle ways by showing that you've done research, showing that you've done all your homework, your background, and that you're somebody that can be trusted. And then the third element that he talked about was logos. It's really the Greek root for word. When we talk about this, and it's been developed over the ages that this really gets more at logic. It's not really about, I mean, certainly the words you choose are part of logic, but it's much more than that. And so when we talk about it in our classes, we talk about appeal to the audience, establish a credibility of the writer, and be as logical as you can be. And you can't really leave one of those elements out without having a flawed proposal. In other words, if you say to yourself, all we need is logic and credibility, if there's no effort to engage with the audience, then it's not going to be as effective as something that really engages the desires and the concerns of an audience. So that's page 8. If you look at page 9 of that PowerPoint presentation, you'll see this is just my effort to show that there are a lot of different ways to engage with the emotions of an audience. I would think that a lot of times if you're writing an engineering proposal, you are looking for the desire, you're realizing that your audience often desires efficiency, desires ways of saving money. They're also thinking about goodwill and charity and sometimes sustainability. And so you think about all of these different ways that you can engage. What do people want out there? What are they driving for? Are they trying to get a healthier environment? And if that's the case, how can I build an argument that appeals to those values? So it's really about picking details, facts, evidence that will appeal to the values of the audience. And then beyond just that pathos, that appeal to the audience's desires and needs, when you're thinking about your ethos as a writer, that's your credibility or your trustworthiness, there are lots of different ways to establish that as in a subtle way as you're writing. The most obvious is to provide thorough research, of course, giving credit where credit is due. But I would suggest also that you want to avoid a smokescreen of jargon and acronyms, because that's how it can look to some reviewers on a proposal panel. If they're looking at something and they see suddenly 5 acronyms in one sentence, or 10 new acronyms in a paragraph, and none of those are spelled out and nothing is explained, and it's just assumed that they know that, some people will know those terms, and others will think, well, I'm supposed to be impressed by this, but I'm really not because I can't even follow this. And then an aggravation will set in where they'll feel like, I don't know if I want to fund this because I don't know if I trust this person to be clear and explain exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so I would say making your document as clear as you can for a multidisciplinary audience is one way to establish your credibility. And then as you're thinking about the logic of your document, now this is in the statement of the problem where you're trying to argue for the need of the work, I would say go back to the old rules that you've been taught since very young, which are things like break things into manageable chunks, into paragraphs that are unified around some key idea that is placed right at the beginning of the paragraph. Now, this may seem very elementary, but I see seniors in engineering design courses all the time who forget this. They load up paragraphs that are full of little details, and they don't have a topic sentence anywhere. And then they just have what I call pseudo-paragraphs, where they just create breaks, and it looks like maybe those things are related, but they don't have one sentence that pulls it all together. So I think that's fine for a draft. What you do is you go back then after you've got those details and you say, what's this paragraph about? I'm going to put a topic sentence in at the beginning that tells people this is what this is about. This is the point of this paragraph. And it really helps unify. It's sort of an umbrella sentence, perhaps, if you want to look at it that way. That can help emphasize the key ideas that you're making in your document. And then you build in transitions between the paragraphs. Don't forget to do that. There has to be some logical connection between what just happened and where you're going next. If it seems random, people will get lost, they'll stop reading, and they won't feel the urgency that you're really trying to create in that argument. So there are other ways to create cohesion in a statement of the problem. You do things like you repeat key words. If you've mentioned some key words at the end of a previous paragraph, pick up those key words in the topic sentence of the next paragraph. So you go with that, and then you use meaningful transition words. Don't neglect words like however, in contrast to, because. These are all very powerful transitional words. And I can make a document available that will just sort of give people a sense of, okay, what are all of the different conjunctions and transitional phrases that can be used that can really help glue a document better together better. So thinking about all of those things, keeping terms consistent as well. If you're repeating key ideas, it's not effective if you're changing your terms every time, because people who may be slightly outside of your discipline may be confused by those things. A simple example of this is I had a student once who was talking about CAT scans and CT scans, and the students in his group kept saying, well, is he going to do CAT scans or CT scans? And he was sitting there saying to them, oh, it's the same thing. I was just trained. And then I heard him say, I changed it up because I wanted to have some variety in the prose. And I thought, whoa, boy, this is a powerful tool, but it can really be used to shoot your foot off, because you want to have variety, but don't change up your key terms, because you can really confuse people that way. So emphasizing the connections between your ideas, and then that key thing, and I'm almost done here, is connecting as you've created this argument for need, the urgency is evident in your statement of the problem, and then you're finally going to switch over to the section that's going to be about the objectives of your proposal. You have to really be able to key in those objectives to the things that you've been mentioning in the statement of the problem. I was looking at a proposal recently. Again, it was written